This is lecture number 33 in the series, The ABCs of Communism. It will be chapter 50 in next year's edition of the ABCs of Communism. That will be the Bolshevism 2016 version. This is about the empire striking back, and in this case against Nicaragua. Now, you'll recall that in our initial chapter on Nicaragua, we brought the story of the Nicaraguan fight for communism up to the victory of 1979. Now we're going to review the last 36 years of the empire striking back. The counterattack by U.S. imperialism featured the empire in an all-out attack on the revolution. The inheritance features the U.S. client Somocista regime that had terribly distorted the Nicaraguan economy. Nicaragua's capital of Managua, from where Somoza's power had emanated throughout the territory he controlled, was a de facto Central American viceroyalty of the U.S. colonial variety. From this imperial center, productive goods such as cotton, sugar, and other tropical agricultural products were owned by Somoza, his family, and comprador lords. These people nominally owned all sectors of the economy of Nicaragua. By nominally, I mean they had title deed to properties financed by the U.S. imperialists. This property ownership included for them the direct ownership of agricultural brands and monopoly groups and the right to sell such to other compradors or directly to the U.S. imperialists. In all these cases, their positions made them the beneficiaries. In other words, Somoza or his placeholders owned or sold all of Nicaragua's banks, ports, communications, services, and most of the land as they were ordered to administer those for the empire. Now, in the reconstruction, which follows the successful seizure of power by the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the Nicaraguan Revolution brought immense restructuring and reforms to all sectors of the economy. It had very little choice since the economy is so totally distorted by the Somocista gangs and their U.S. imperialist bosses. Now it was directed toward a mixed capitalist and government economy system. The inheritance meant that the initial biggest economic impact was on the primary sector, which was agriculture. This impact came in the form of the agrarian reform. From the beginning of the revolution, this reform was supposed to be a process that would develop along with other structural changes. These other structural changes included economic reforms needed to rescue the inherited, deformed Nicaraguan economy. As a U.S. colonial country, Nicaragua had an agricultural-based economy which was necessarily undeveloped and susceptible to the vacillation of international capitalist market prices for its agricultural goods, particularly coffee and cotton. The revolution had inherited a rural economy, slave labor-based, technologically backward economy, and the capitalists at home and abroad had made up for capital investment by their super-exploitation of this de facto enslaved labor force. This backward economy, created by the empire, would now have to be rebuilt, and it was. All this had to happen, however, while under attack in the soon-to-come civil war conducted by imperial mercenaries called Contras. Article 1 of the Agrarian Reform Law says that property is guaranteed if it is labored efficiently, and that there could be different forms of property, the first of which was state property from the confiscated land of the Somocistas. The second was cooperative property, that is, part of confiscated land but without individual certificate of ownerships to be worked efficiently. Communal property was the third form, and this came mainly from communities from the Mosquito Indian regions, which you'll recall is the eastern half of Nicaragua, and borders on the Atlantic. And finally, we have individual property. Now, all that is required of individual capitalists is loyalty to the revolution, and that they efficiently exploit this property and integrate it within the national plans of development. The principles that directed the agrarian reform were the same ones for all economic sectors of the nation: pluralism, loyalty, meaning national unity, and economic democracy. In practice, the Nicaraguan agrarian reform developed in 4 phases. The first phase started immediately in 1979, and that consisted of a confiscation of all of the property of Somoza and his agents. The second phase began in 1981 under the Agrarian Reform Law of July 19th of 1981. The third phase lasted from 1984 to 85, and that was a massive cession of land individually responding to demands from the peasantry. And finally, a fourth phase beginning in 1986 under the Agrarian Reform Law of that year, and is referred to usually as the reform to the 1981 law. In 1985, the Agrarian Reform distributed 235,000 acres, or 950 square kilometers of land, to the formerly enslaved or enserfed peasantry. This represented about 75% of all land distributed to peasants after 1980. Peasants, big, small farmers. According to the plan, the agrarian reform had the twofold purpose of increasing the support for the government among the free small farmers and guaranteeing ample food delivery into the cities. During 1985, ceremonies were held throughout the countryside in which the president, Daniel Ortega, would give each newly propertied small farmer a title to the land and a rifle to defend it. The Nicaraguan Revolution brought a cultural revolution along with it, and this constituted all kinds of different cultural activities that to develop throughout the country. Undoubtedly, the most important was planning and execution of the Nicaraguan literacy campaign. I'm not going to bother with the Spanish names here since most of my audience is going to be English speaking. They're in the book, however. The literacy campaign used secondary school students, university students, as well as teachers as volunteer teachers. Now, this was largely based upon the experience of the Cubans, who had managed to mobilize the educated portion of the Cuban population the revolution had, and had changed a largely illiterate nation into a completely literate nation within a few years. Within 5 months, the Nicaraguans had reduced the overall illiteracy rate from 50.3% to 12.9%. Now that's a lot in 5 months. Therefore, in September 1980, UNESCO awarded Nicaragua with the Nadezhda K. Krupskaya Award. You recall that UNESCO award is named after Vladimir Lenin's wife, and that was for that successful literacy campaign. This initial campaign was followed by the literacy campaigns of 1982, 86, 87, 95, and 2000, all of which were also awarded by UNESCO. The revolution also founded a Ministry of Culture, one of only 3 in Latin America at that time, and established a new editorial brand called Editorial Nueva Nicaragua, and that's the name of a publishing house, and started to print cheap editions of basic books rarely seen by Nicaraguans at all. The revolution founded an Instituto de Estudios del Sandinismo, or that is, Institute for Studies of Sandinismo. The institute printed all of the works and papers of Augusto C. Sandino and the writings of FSLN leaders such as Carlos Fonseca, Ricardo Morales Aviles, among others. And the essential large-scale programs of the Sandinistas received international recognition for their gains in literacy, healthcare, education, childcare, unions, and on land reform. Well, of course, all of this was antithetical to what the United States government wanted. They want a completely illiterate nation of essential slaves working for their corporations. So they launched a war against the Nicaraguans, and they called them, I call this section, War Against the U.S. Contras. The less fascist Carter administration worked surreptitiously against the FSLN in 1979 and 1980. With the advent of the more fascist Reagan administration, the empire launched an openly vicious anti-communist strategy for dealing with Latin America in general. Accordingly, in Nicaragua, it attempted to isolate the Sandinista regime. In 1981, from Carter's covert CIA campaign beginning in 1980, the CIA launched its anti-Sandinista movement they called Contra-Revolucion, or counter-revolution, or just Contras. Excuse me. This conspiracy was based along the border with Honduras. The initial Contras were former members of the Somoza regime's National Guard, still loyal to Somoza, who were now living in exile in Honduras. In addition to the Contra units who continued to be loyal to Somoza, the CIA sent a small army of its own in-house thugs, and it supplemented these professional killers with many mercenary thugs from other fascist centers. The Gringo Shock headquarters maintained in places like Guatemala, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, and others. The CIA agents in the eastern half of the country organized opposition from members of the Mosquito ethnic groups. You will recall from Chapter 32 that the Mosquito advanced theocratic chieftains of Nicaragua's remote Mosquito Coast region along the Caribbean Sea had long resisted Spanish rule and eventually allied with the Brits. The CIA pitch to them this time was more intelligent than the Somoza thugs pitched to western Nicaragua. To the Mosquito, they suggested demanding a larger share of self-determination and/or autonomy. And we're going to talk more about this failed policy later on, but at any rate, the FSLN refused to grant this and instead walked into the CIA trap. The government tried forced relocations using its armed forces, and we reviewed this subject again in Chapter 48 above on Honduras. The empire doubles down. Upon taking office in January 1981, Ronald Reagan canceled Carter's phony economic aid to Nicaragua, and on the 6th of August 1981, he signed National Security Decision Directive No. 7, which was top secret and which authorized the production and shipment of arms to the region. On the 17th of November of that year, 1981, President Reagan signed National Security Directive 17, and that authorized full covert support to anti-Sandinista forces. Another Vietnam-style colonial war was now going to take place. An armed conflict soon arose, adding to the destabilization of the region. You'll recall from the lectures we've just gone through that the CIA had been unfolding such Vietnam-style civil wars through the Central American area in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. The Contras, fully armed, advised, and directed by the CIA, secretly opened a second front on the Nicaraguan Atlantic coast and along the Costa Rican border. With the Civil War open and cracks in the National Revolutionary Project, the FSLN's military expenditures grew to more than half of the annual budget. The Patriotic Military Service, a compulsory draft, was also established. By 1982, Contra forces had begun carrying out assassinations of members of the Nicaraguan government. In 1983, the Contras had launched a major offensive, and the CIA was providing them with mines, helping them to install the mines in Nicaragua's harbors, with the idea of preventing foreign weapons shipments from arriving, and of course disrupting maritime trade in general. The 1987 Iran-Contra affair exposed the Reagan administration at the center of the CIA's secret Contra war. The rebel base in Cuba comes to the defense of Nicaragua when Fidel Castro and the rebel base in Cuba came in, and as they had been kept informed of the imperial plot against Nicaragua from the beginning by the DGI, the General Direction of Intelligence in Cuba. As U.S. forces began to gain some success in that former gringo colony, the Nicaraguans called for assistance, and they got it. In the 1984 general election, which was held on November 4th of that year, over 1.5 million citizens registered in July, and 1,170,000 voted, or about 75.4% of the eligible voters. The no votes were 6% of the total, and international observers declared the election free and fair. Of course, the empire under Reagan denounced the elections as a Soviet-style sham. At any rate, the national votes for president gave Daniel Ortega 66.97%. I won't bother reading the others because they won't really mean that much to you at this time, but they're in the book. The Esquipulas Peace Agreement. The Esquipulas Peace Agreement was an initiative in the mid-1980s to settle the military conflicts that had plagued Central America for many years. In the case of Guatemala, for decades, and we just reviewed that in the immediately preceding lectures. It built upon groundwork laid by the Contadora group, Contadoras in Panama, from 1983 to 1985. The agreement was named for Esquipulas, Guatemala, where the initial meetings took place, and the U.S. Congress lobbying efforts were led by one of Capitol Hill's top lobbyists, William C. Casey. In May of '86, a summit meeting, the Esquipulas I, took place, attended by the 5 Central American presidents. On February 15th of 1987, then Costa Rican President Oscar Arias submitted the peace plan for this meeting. During '86 and '87, the Esquipulas process was established, in which the Central Americans heads of state agreed on economic cooperation and a framework for peaceful conflict resolution. Thus, the Esquipulas II Accord, signed in Guatemala City by 5 presidents on August 7th of 1987, the following year. Esquipulas II defined a number of measures to promote national reconciliation, an end to hostilities, democratization, free elections, the termination of all assistance to irregular forces, negotiations on arms control, and assistance to refugees. It also laid the ground for international verification procedures and provided a timetable for implementation. Now, in 1990, general elections were held, and they constituted a setback for the Sandinista leadership. The CIA organized a strategy for winning the election by creating an outfit called UNO, or National Opposition Union. This UNO was a coalition of political parties. It succeeded in matching the electoral strength of the FSLN political front and accordingly took the presidency. The winner for UNO was Violeta Barrios de Chamorro. She came from the Chamorro family we discussed in the earlier chapter on the fight for communism in Nicaragua. She had been a member of the National Reconstruction Junta. She was the widow of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, who, you will recall, was assassinated by Somoza on January 10, 1978. Defeated were FSLN leaders Daniel Ortega, president, and Sergio Ramirez, vice president. And this time, the Nicaraguan general election gave her 54.7% of the vote, the FSLN coming in second at 40.82%. I won't go through the other parties. Now let's take a look at the rise and fall of this UNO. Nicaraguan historian and leading social investigator Robert J. Kahina describes UNO as follows. Quote, "Since the very moment of inception, under the political guidance and technical and financial support from the government of the U.S., the existence of UNO was marked by grave structural deformations derived from its own nature. In its conformation concurred the most diverse currents of Nicaraguan political and ideological range, and they were from the liberal conservative, traditionally anti-communist wing of society, to a pro-U.S., of the pro-U.S. variety, to Marxist-Leninists from the Moscow lineage, by which he means, of course, the Russian modern revisionists of that time. They openly declared supporters of class struggle and enemies of capitalism in its superior developmental stage to be in alliance with these right-wing nutballs. The constitution of the UNO coalition for the 1990 general election was as follows, and then I'll go through all of that, but we don't need to do it right here in this lecture. It's in the book. By 1986, however, the Contras were besieged by charges of corruption, human rights abuses, and military ineptitude. They couldn't win anything. A much vaunted early 1986 offensive never materialized, and Contra forces were largely reduced to isolated acts of terrorism. In October '87, however, the Contras did stage a successful attack in southern Nicaragua. And then in December of '87, the FDN launched attacks at La Bonanza, La Ciuna, and La Rosita. FDN, as you're going to see in a moment, is a main CIA organization fighting the government. And that all 3 of those resulted in heavy fighting. ARDE, the Southern Front, another CIA organization we'll be talking about in a minute, also conducted attacks in El Almendro and along the Rama Road. These large-scale raids mainly became possible as the Contras were able to use U.S.-provided red-eye missiles against Sandinista MiG-24 helicopter gunships, which had been supplied by the Soviets. Nevertheless, the Contras remained tenuously encamped within Honduras and weren't able to hold on to Nicaraguan territory. So, with all of this CIA equipment, they were able to, and Pentagon provided equipment, they were able to make raids, but they couldn't hold territory. There were isolated protests among the population against the draft implemented by the Sandinista government, and occasionally the CIA was able to whip these up into full-blown street clashes, as in Masaya in 1988. However, polls showed the Sandinista government still enjoyed strong support from Nicaraguans. Political opposition groups were splintered, and the Contras began to experience defections, although U.S. aid maintained them as a viable military force. Viable in the sense that they're alive in Honduras. After a cutoff in U.S. military support, and with both sides facing international pressure to bring an end to the conflict, the Contras agreed to negotiations with the FSLN. With the help of 5 Central American presidents, including Ortega, it was agreed that a voluntary demobilization of the Contras should start in December '89 in order to facilitate free and fair elections in Nicaragua in February 1990, even though the Reagan administration had pushed for a delay in the Contra disbandment. Well, as in a resulting February 1990 elections, when Violeta Chamorro and her party, the UNO, won an upset victory of 55% to Ortega's 41%, even though the polls leading up to the election had clearly indicated an FSLN victory, this put an even greater damper on the CIA's Contra program. In November '89, the White House had announced that the economic embargo against Nicaragua would continue unless Violeta Chamorro won. Also, there had been reports of intimidation from the side of the Contras, with a Canadian observer mission confirming 42 people killed by the Contras in election violence in October '89. This led many commentators to assume that Nicaraguans had voted against the Sandinistas out of fear of a continuation of the Contra War and economic deprivation. Finally, the CIA organized electoral fraud assisted by the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, the FBI, and the Democratic and Republican parties and their national organizations, all having much experience in ballot fraud. Why it would take time to recover. The combination of Contra terror, U.S. intimidation, ballot fraud, and the apparent collapse of communist ideology as the gringo propaganda machine in overdrive was promoting, all combined to take votes from the Sandinistas. But in the last analysis, it was the demoralization caused by the great traitor Michael Gorbachev that was undoubtedly the most important factor. It would require time to educate everyone, intellectuals and the masses, as to what modern revisionism had done. It would take time for everyone to learn the lessons of modern revisionist betrayal. It would take time to realize that Trotskyism did not have the answers, because it was also fundamentally, fatally flawed, and to learn the truth about how anti-Leninist revisionism worked and what had to be done about it. Now, Violeta Barrios Torres de Chamorro, her regime lasted from 1990 to 1996. She was born in October 1929, and she became a Nicaraguan political leader, primarily because she was married to the publisher Chamorro until he was assassinated. She became president of Nicaragua on April 25, 1990, when she unseated Daniel Ortega, as we've just mentioned. She was elected as head of the 14-party anti-Sandinista alliance, known as the National Opposition Union, or UNO, an alliance that ranged from conservatives and liberals to revisionist communists. She left office on January 10, 1997. Venezuela's former president, Carlos Andres Perez, was put to trial in his country after it was discovered that he had embezzled funds to support the campaign that got Violeta Chamorro to the presidency. In this embezzlement, he was acting as an agent of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, with mechanical assistance from the U.S. CIA. The CIA-UNO Electoral Conspiracy summarized. In the Nicaraguan general election of 1990 that brought Violeta Chamorro to power, in this coalition of anti-Sandinista parties ranging from the left to the right of the political spectrum. The defeat shocked the Sandinistas. They had expected to win. Commentators such as Noam Chomsky and Brian Wilson attributed the outcome to the U.S. Contra threats to continue the war if the Sandinistas retained power, the general war weariness of the Nicaraguan population, and the abysmal Nicaraguan economic situation. And as I've just pointed out, I would add to that, those things all being true, that the general demoralization of the communist movement caused by what the great traitor Michael Gorbachev had just pulled off, and the next traitor, the Fidel Castro-hating new president of Russia, what's his name, Yeltsin, was so demoralizing to the communists around the world, especially here in Latin America, that that pretty well undermined the ability of the FSLN to win the election. Exit polls of Nicaraguans reported Chamorro's victory over Ortega was achieved with a 55% majority, and that turned out to be correct, but that 55% was achieved by intimidation, outright ballot fraud, and largely because of the demoralization of Ortega's supporters. At any rate, she came to office with an economy in ruins, and now they had to do something because of the Contra War. She had to do something about that. In the next election, the Nicaraguan election of 1996, Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas of the FSLN were defeated again, this time by Arnoldo Alemán of the Constitutional Liberal Party, another right-wing nutball party. In the 2001 elections, the PLC again defeated the FSLN, with Alemán's vice president, Enrique Bolaños, succeeding him as president. Subsequently, however, Alemán was convicted and sentenced in 2003 to 20 years in prison for embezzlement. That is the first guy that had defeated, that had followed Violeta Chamorro. So he went to jail for embezzlement, money laundering, and corruption. And so his successor, the man who had been his vice president, is now president, and he's coming in with a big cloud on over his head. The Liberal and Sandinista Parliament members subsequently combined to strip the presidential powers of President Bolaños and his ministers, calling for his resignation and threatening impeachment. The Sandinistas said they no longer supported Bolaños after U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell told Bolaños to keep his distance from the FSLN. This slow-motion coup d'etat was averted, partially by pressure from the Central American presidents, who vowed not to recognize any such government. Well, the UNO wins again under, as I just mentioned, under Arnoldo Alemán from the Liberal Alliance Party. And, well, we don't have to go over all that again. I go into in more detail of what they did right, what they did wrong. He was succeeded by Enrique José Bolaños, who ruled then from 2002 to 2007. He was another one of these gringo-educated guys who had been a right-winger all of his life, who had opposed the Sandinista-controlled government of the 1980s. He had been in jail for a period of time. His family had been of the latifundista class, concentrating on cotton farming. Their company called SAIMSA, S-A-I-M-S-A, had been nationalized during the first Sandinista administration of the 1980s under the confiscation for treason provisions aimed at supporters of the Somoza fascist regime. Bolaños, as we have seen, had been vice president under his predecessor, Arnoldo Alemán, who is now in prison for corruption, money laundering. At any rate, on the 4th of November 2001, he had defeated Daniel Ortega, and he took the presidency in 2002, and he kept it until early 2007. He was a member of the Constitutional Liberal Party. Okay, and now he's gone, and his new job is as a member of the International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation. He's associated with several U.S. universities, Columbia, the University of Virginia, with an outfit called the Fundación Enrique Bolaños, the Enrique Bolaños Foundation, and something called Operation Smile. Well, The return of the Sandinistas came about in the legislative and presidential elections that took place on November 5th, 2006. Daniel Ortega returned to the presidency with roughly 38% of the vote. The percentage was enough to win the presidency outright because of a change in electoral law lowering the percentage requiring a runoff election from 45 to 35% with a 5% margin of victory. Nicaragua's 2011 general election results resulted in the re-election of Daniel Ortega with a landslide victory of 62.46%. In 2014, the National Assembly approved changes to the Constitution, allowing Daniel Ortega to run for a third successive terms and removed time limits on how many terms a president could serve. So I think it's safe to say Ortega will be president of Nicaragua for a long time yet to come. Well, the end of the CIA-UNO conspiracy brought the second presidency for Daniel Ortega and the FSLN from 2006 to the present. And he won that election by 62.5%. And we don't need to go through the other party votes because they're in the book. If you're interested, you can take a look at them. Off and running. Soon after his inauguration, Ortega paid an official visit to Iran and met Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Ortega told the press that the revolutions of Iran and Nicaragua are almost twin revolutions, since both revolutions are about justice, liberty, self-determination, and the struggle against imperialism. Since the start of his second presidency, various measures have been introduced to combat hunger and to improve access to health care, education, credit, and Social Security. In addition, other reforms have been carried out, including an enhancement of labor rights, the introduction of low-interest loans, training for female micro-entrepreneurs in rural areas, and the distribution of transport subsidies, scholarships, medicine, land titles, and housing materials throughout the population. Altogether, these policies have helped to reduce high levels of poverty and inequality in Nicaragua. In June of 2008, the Nicaraguan Supreme Electoral Council disqualified the MRS and the Conservative Party from participation. In November 2008, the Supreme Electoral Council received national and international criticism following irregularities in municipal elections, but agreed to review results for Managua only, while the opposition had demanded a nationwide review. Official results show Sandinista candidates winning 94 of 146 municipal mayoralities, compared to 46 for the opposition Liberal Constitutional Party. As a result of U.S.-inspired fraud allegations, the European Union suspended $70 million of aid and the U.S. $64 million. These allegations were, of course, just an excuse to renew economic warfare against the Sandinista government. With the 2008 world capitalist collapse started by the U.S. 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, Ortega said that capitalism is in its death throes, and the Bolivarian alternative for the people of Latin America, ALBA, ALBA, is the most advanced, Christian, and fairest project. He also said God was punishing the United States with a financial crisis for trying to impose its neoliberal economic principles on poor countries, and said God was rewarding Nicaragua with an increase in GDP to $2,600 per capita from the $1,800 a decade previously. Quote, "It's incredible that in the most powerful country in the world, which spends billions of dollars on brutal wars, people do not have enough money to stay in their homes," unquote. During an interview with David Frost for the Al Jazeera English program Frost Over the World in March of 2009, Ortega suggested that he would like to change the Constitution to allow him to run again for president. In Judicial Decision 504 issued on October 19th of 2009, the Supreme Court of Nicaragua declared portions of Articles 147 and 78 of the Constitution of Nicaragua inapplicable. These were the provisions concerning the eligibility of candidates for president, vice president, mayor, and vice mayor, and this decision also had the effect of allowing Ortega to run for re-election in 2011, and increasing popular Sandinista officials were also now going to be able to run for re-election. While supporting abortion rights during his presidency during the 1980s, Ortega had since embraced the Catholic Church's position of strong opposition. While non-emergency abortions have long been illegal in Nicaragua, recently even abortions in the case where the pregnancy endangers the mother's life, otherwise known as therapeutic abortions, had been made illegal in the days before Ortega's returning victory via election. Now all that changed. Ortega denied that abortion legislation outlaws medical procedures necessary to save a woman's life if they resulted in the termination of pregnancy. Quote, "The medical procedural code," he says, "is not affected by the law and requires doctors to do what is necessary to save a woman's life if it is threatened by conditions related to her pregnancy," unquote. He noted that the accusations that the abortion law outlaws medical procedures necessary to save the life of the mother are part of a media war. On 2 December 2008, during ceremonies for the 29th anniversary of the founding of the Nicaraguan Army, Ortega announced that Nicaragua recognizes the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia and fully supports the Russian government's position. You'll recall that this has to do with the Georgian attack on those two areas that the Russian army came in and rescued. A day after Venezuela recognized the two republics, Nicaragua also established diplomatic relations with Abkhazia and followed by establishing diplomatic links with South Ossetia. Ortega met with Taiwan's president in 2009 and both agreed to improve the diplomatic ties between both countries. This was fine with the People's Republic of China, which allows a special status for Taiwan. Nicaragua hosted a trade show from the PRC in Managua in 2010. Ortega was re-elected president with a vote on November 6th and confirmation on November 16th of 2011. In January 2014, the National Assembly, dominated by the FSLN, approved constitutional amendments that abolished term limits for the presidency and allowed a president to run for an unlimited number of 5-year terms. Again, I think we can expect to see Daniel Ortega as president of Nicaragua for a long time yet to come. Okay, now, the most important next development is China and the canal. This is what Ortega calls the second phase of the Nicaraguan Revolution. The canal, I mean. The Nicaraguan Canal and Development Project, also referred to as the Nicaragua Grand Canal and the Nicaragua Interoceanic Grand Canal, is a shipping route under construction through Nicaragua to connect the Caribbean Sea, and therefore the Atlantic Ocean, with the Pacific Ocean. In June 2013, Nicaragua's National Assembly approved a bill to grant a 50-year concession to finance and manage the project to the private Hong Kong Nicaragua Canal Development Investment Company, HKND Group, headed by Mr. Wang Jing, a Chinese billionaire. The concession can be extended for another 50 years once the waterway is operational. Construction of the canal, estimated to cost 40 to 50 billion US dollars, began in December last year, with completion due within 5 years. Scientists have been concerned about the environmental impact of the project, as Lake Nicaragua is Central America's key freshwater reservoir. But as the results of the plans have unfolded, you can see that that is not going to be a problem because, for one thing, none of the water for the canal is going to come out of Lake Nicaragua. Construction of a canal using the San Juan River as an access route to Lake Nicaragua was first proposed in the early U.S. colonial era. The U.S. abandoned plans to construct a waterway in Nicaragua in the early 20th century after it purchased the French interest in the Panama Canal and tore Panama away from Colombia. The history of attempts to build a Nicaragua canal connected the Caribbean Sea and thus the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean go back at least to 1825, when the Federal Republic of Central America hired surveyors to study a route to Lake Nicaragua. Many other proposals have followed. Despite the operation of the Panama Canal that opened in 1914, interest in the Nicaragua Canal has always continued. With the emergence of globalization, an increase in commerce, and the cost of fuel and the size of the ships, the limitations of the Panama Canal, the concept of a second canal across the American land bridge became more attractive, and in 2006, the president of Nicaragua, Enrique Bolaños, announced his intention of Nicaragua proceeding with such a project. Even with the Panama Canal expansion project expected at that time to be completed in 2015, some ships will still be too big for the Panama Canal. On September 26th of 2012, the Nicaraguan government of Daniel Ortega and the newly formed Hong Kong Nicaragua Canal Development Group, HKND, signed a Memorandum of Understanding. Now, the agreement commits this private capitalist company to finance and build the Nicaraguan Canal and Development Project. The Nicaraguan government subsequently approved the Master Concession Agreement with HKND on June 13, 2013, Nicaragua granting the company the sole rights for planning, designing, constructing, and thereafter to operate and manage the Nicaragua Grand Canal and other related projects, including ports, a free trade zone, and an international airport, and other infrastructure projects, and Nicaragua commits its national treasury as collateral for its portion of the cost of this project. The agreement will last for 50 years and is renewable for another 50 years, so it's actually a 100-year agreement. HKND will pay the government of Nicaragua $10 million annually for 10 years, and thereafter a portion of the revenues starting at 1% and increasing annually year by year until it reaches about 50%. The CIA contractor spy group, which is called Stratfor, you are reading more about it all the time because WikiLeaks keeps releasing their top secret reports done for the CIA, says that after 10 years some ownership shares will be handed over to Nicaragua, and periodically thereafter more shares assigned to the government, until after 50 years Nicaragua would be the majority shareholder. So this is a kind of agreement that you could hardly turn down. The HKND group has begun the study phase of development to assess the technological and economic feasibility of constructing a canal in Nicaragua, as well as the potential environmental, social, and regional implications of various routes. The canal and other associated projects is financed by investors throughout the world and generates jobs for Nicaragua and other Central American countries. So this is a win-win-win thing for everybody that wants to get involved. Initial findings of the commercial analysis conducted by HKND Group indicate that the combined impact of growth in east-west trade and in ship sizes could provide a compelling argument for the construction of a second canal substantially larger than the expanded Panama Canal across Central America. And within 10 to 15 years, growth in global maritime trade is expected to cause congestions and delays in transit through the Panama Canal at any rate, so there has to be a complementary route through some part of the isthmus. Additionally, by 2030, the volume of trade that a Nicaraguan canal could serve will have grown by 240% from today. In June of 2013, the National Assembly of Nicaragua's Infrastructure Committee unanimously voted in favor of the project, with 4 members abstaining. On June 13, 2013, Nicaragua's legislature passed the legislation granting the concession. 2 days later, on June 15th, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega and the chairman of HKND Group, Mr. Wang Jing, signed the concession agreement giving HKND Groups the right to construct and manage the canal and its associated project. Wang Jing, a Chinese billionaire who leads and wholly owns HKND Group, announced at a press briefing in June of 2013 that he had successfully attracted global investors to the tune of $40 billion in a finance trust. In January of 2014, Wang Jing and President Ortega issued a statement that construction of the project would begin in December 2014 and that it would be completed in 2019. On July 7th of 2014, a 173-mile route for the Nicaragua Canal was approved. This route starts from the mouth of the Brito River on the Pacific side, passes through Lake Nicaragua, and ends up in the Punta Gorda River on the Caribbean. The punta will be the canal will be between 230 and 520 meters deep, that is 755 to 1,706 feet wide, and 91 feet deep. The Toronto Star noted that Chinese engineer Dong Yung-song said the canal's design called for the creation of a 400 square kilometers, that is 150 square mile, artificial lake. The water to fill the canal's giant locks will come from that artificial lake, not from Lake Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega, whose government approved the agreement within 1 week in June of 2013, sees the canal as, quote, the second phase of the Nicaraguan revolution, unquote, predicting that it will pull Nicaragua out of poverty and to lead to the creation of 250,000 permanent jobs. The Moscow Times has reported that Russia will take part in the building of the Nicaragua Canal. Construction began December 29, 2014, and officially started a week earlier. China Harbor Engineering Company, an experienced construction company, will design, construct, and finance a fourth set of locks in Panama, where it has opened a regional headquarters. The 260-kilometer-long canal will have 3 sections. The first is the West Canal that runs from the Brito at the Pacific Ocean up the Rio Brito Valley, crosses the Continental Divide, and after passing through Rio Las Lajas Valley, enters Lake Nicaragua. Its length is 30 kilometers. The Nicaragua Lake section measures 107 kilometers and runs from 4 kilometers south of San Jorge to 8 kilometers south of San Miguelito. The Eastern Canal is the longest section with 127 kilometers and will be built along the Rio Tule Valley through the Caribbean Highland to the Rio Punta Gorda Valley to meet the Caribbean Sea. Both the West Canal and the East Canal will each have 1 lock with 3 consecutive chambers to raise ships to the level of Lake Nicaragua that has an average water elevation of 31.3 meters and a range of 30.2 to 33.0 meters. The Western Brito Lock is 14.5 kilometers inland from the Pacific, and the Eastern Camilo Lock is 14 kilometers inland from the Caribbean Sea. The dimensions of each of the chambers of the locks are 1,776 feet long, 246 feet wide, and 91 feet deep. As locks generally define the limit of the size of ships that can be handled, the Nicaragua Canal is being designed to allow passage for larger ships than those that pass through the Panama Canal. For comparisons, the new third set of locks in the Panama Canal expansion will only be 1,401 feet long and 100 feet wide and 60 feet deep. No water from Lake Nicaragua is planned to be used to flood the locks. Water will come from local rivers and recycling using water-saving basins and from that artificial lake. The Camilo Lock will be built adjacent to a new dam of the upper Punta Gorda River that creates a reservoir. This Atlanta Reservoir, or Lake Atlanta, will have a surface area of nearly 400 square kilometers. West of the Atlanta Reservoir, the Rio Aguasarca will be dammed to create a second reservoir. This reservoir would have a surface area of about 49 square kilometers and hold 1,100 gigaliters. A hydropower facility would be built at the dam, and it's expected to generate over 10 megawatts of power to be used for operations of the Camilo Lock. Both locks would also be connected to the country's power grid and have backup generator facilities. It is estimated that each lock uses about 9 megawatts of power. At each oceanic entrance of the canal, breakwaters and port facilities will be constructed. The Pacific port will be named Brito Port and the Caribbean one Aguila Port. Additionally, these 2 ports will help during construction and later become international ports. Their design capacity is 106.68 million TEU per year and 2.5 million TEU per year, respectively. Existing port facilities at Corinto and Bluefields will be improved to allow for shipment of material to the entry ports under construction. Fuel storage sites will be placed at the 2 port sites. 4 lighthouses will be constructed at the entrances to the East and West Canal. In addition, the channel entrance on sea will be marked on both sides with a large sailing buoy about 2 miles offshore, and 2 light buoys will mark the passage through Lake Nicaragua. Navigation and lock control centers will be established. A free trade zone with commercial facilities, as well as tourist hotels and an international airport at Rivas, are planned to be built when canal construction is advanced. Appropriate road improvements are planned. The Pan American Highway would cross the canal via a bridge. Nicaragua Route 25, that is the Acoyapa-San Carlos route on the eastern side of Lake Nicaragua, will get a ferry service. Both ports will get public road connections. HKND plans to construct a private gravel maintenance road on both sides of the canal. The estimate for the workforce in 2020, when the project is completed, is 3,700 people permanently and 12,700 in 2050 when traffic has increased. Transit time will be about 30 hours. It is projected that by 2020, 3,576 ships will pass the canal annually. The transit rate is expected to increase to 4,138 by 2030 and to 5,097 by 2050. For comparison, the Panama Canal handles 12,855 transits in total in 2009. On December 22, 2014, the canal project announced construction had started in Rivas, Nicaragua, and HKND Group Chairman Wang Jing spoke during the starting ceremony of the first works of the Interoceanic Grand Canal in Brito Town. HKND Group, that is the Hong Kong-based HK Nicaragua Canal Development Investment Company Limited, led by Wang Jing, runs construction of the new waterway. And according to the plans of HKND, the project entails the development and building of the canal, as well as the supporting infrastructure as follows. And then I go through these 4 different phases. The first phase is the pre-construction phase, where including getting permits, acquiring land and machinery, and finalizing design and plans. The second early construction phase already started in December last year, that is 2014, and will last through September 2015, this year. It secures access, or next month, it secures access to construction sites and provides the critical infrastructure and mobilizes the workforce. The third construction phase begins September this year and goes through March of 2020. This will be the time to dig the canal and build the locks, plus their infrastructure. And fourth, we have the commissioning phase from April 2020 to June 2020, which includes testing of the lock operations and training of lock and tugboat operators. HKND describes the project as the largest civil earth-moving operation in history. Most of this will consist of dry excavation to form the canal, with an estimate of 4,019 cubic meters of material of rock and soil. There will be 739 million cubic meters of freshwater dredging from Lake Nicaragua and 241 million cubic meters of marine dredging in the ocean. Marine dredging of the Oceanic Access Canal will be required on the Pacific side for almost 2 kilometers and on the Caribbean Sea for over 14 kilometers. Disposal of excavation material will be done usually along the canal in designated disposal areas, typically within 3 kilometers of the canal. 2 concrete plants and a steel plant are going to be built to support the project. While cement will probably be imported to assure perfection, the construction aggregate will come from local quarries near the 2 locks. HKND estimates that about 50,000 people will be employed during the 5-year construction period, about half of them from Nicaragua, 25% from China, and the remainder from various other countries. 1,400 workers will be in office or administrative positions, and the rest in the field. The management offices will be rented, purchased and built near Rivas. Workers will live in one of 9 camps, which beside food and shelter would also provide health care and security. These are closed camps. That is, workers cannot leave the camp unless part of an organized activity. This to prevent rowdy behavior disturbing local life. The work schedule calls for 12-hour shifts for 7 days a week. Domestic workers, 2 weeks and get 1 week off, while foreign workers are 6 weeks on and get 2 weeks off. And management gets 22 weeks on and 4 weeks off, as do blue-collar workers. Well, the financing of this are as follows. Project costs are estimated in the region of 40 to 50 billion US dollars, all of which has already been arranged. Besides, private money provided by Wang Jing at the startup, a further influx of financial support is being offered as investment opportunities. An IPO is in preparation to effectuate this and should be marketed in 2015. Already, XCMG, a state-owned Chinese construction company, will provide the machinery and take 1.5% to 3% of HKND shares as payment. Wang Jing admitted that the project, as with any investment, has financial, political, and engineering risks. However, the high cost of the project, that could conceivably reach 100 billion US dollars, has the highest possible rating by Chinese rating companies, and the project is supposed to be completed by 2020. So whatever risk there is has been minimized, and I think as investments go, this is as secure as an investment as a large-scale investor could hope to get. Further, a coast-to-coast railway line to support each phase of the canal construction and eventual use will be built by investors in Honduras. Now, this is much appreciated by investors with international experience in Central America and by progressive elements in Honduras who see it as a financial key to national independence from you-know-who, empowering Honduran indigenous bourgeoisie. Of course, it also provides long-term employment to tens of thousands of Honduran workers as well. And for this reason, it's going to be actively opposed by the CIA, which is attempting to kick off another civil war in Honduras. Legal challenges that the deal violates constitutional rights have already been rejected by the Supreme Court of Nicaragua, and a retrospective rewriting of the Constitution has placed HKND beyond legal challenge. HKND has been granted the right to expropriate landowners within 5 kilometers or 3 miles on each side of the canal, and Wang Jing has promised to pay fair market value. The reserves of the Nicaraguan National Bank serve, as I've said before, as the collateral on the part of Nicaragua for their participation in this project. And of course, they're providing the land bridge. The U.S. CIA organized protests against the construction of the canal shortly after the official ceremony marked the beginning of the construction. The gringo strategy is to scare farmers into protesting against their possible evictions from the lands due to the construction of the canal. However, as we have seen, the Sandinistas have a great deal of experience in fighting U.S. imperialism and have prepared for this and are effectively counteracting U.S. color revolution propaganda. In effect, the CIA campaign is already dead. Inside the Contra Conspiracy. Now let's go back and take a look at that again. This is what the CIA had offered Nicaragua before the Chinese came with their canal, and it's worth taking a close look at why the Nicaraguans want to get as far away from any kind of U.S. financing, any kind of U.S. corporate involvement, and the CIA as they possibly can, and why the government is considering China's offer to build this canal as the second great phase of the Nicaraguan Revolution. Now, the Contras were not a monolithic group at any time, but a combination of 3 distinct elements of Nicaraguan society. The first were the ex-guardsmen of the Nicaraguan National Guard and other right-wing figures who had fought for Nicaragua's ex-dictator Somoza. These later were especially found in the military wing of the outfit called FDN, which we're going to talk about in a minute. 2. Remnants of the Guard later formed groups such as the 15th of September Legion, the Anti-Sandinista Guerrilla Special Forces, and thirdly, the National Army of Liberation. Initially, however, these groups were small and conducted little active raiding into Nicaragua. Anti-Somocistas of the original Broad Coalition separated themselves and were exposed as traitors. For example, Edgar Chamorro, a prominent member of the political directorate of the FDN, and Jose Francisco Cardenal, who had briefly served in the Council of State before leaving Nicaragua and under CIA direction had founded the Nicaraguan Democratic Union, UDN, of Nicaraguan exiles in wherever, of course, Miami. Another example is the CIA and country organization MILPAS, which stands literally for Milicias Populares Antisandinistas, in the northern mountains of Nicaragua. The CIA had used Pedro Joaquin Gonzalez to front this outfit, and he had given it the name Milpistas. Even after his death, other Milpas bands sprouted during 80 and 81. The Milpistas were composed largely of tricked peasants from the Nicaraguan highlands and press-ganged rural workers. Okay, you know, press gang means that some guys go out and they grab you out of a bar or wherever and make you work on their ship or in their army unit or wherever it may be. In the old British days, of course, once the press gang found you on someplace and put you on a ship, the ship sailed, you're stuck with them for years. At any rate, the main CIA groups were first of all, the Contra Commandos from FDN and Arde Frente Sur in the Nuevo Guinea area in 1987. Members of Arde Frente Sur routed the FSL garrison at El Serrano in southeast Nicaragua in 87. Thirdly were the actual CIA and Argentine intelligence organizations themselves. Fourth, the 15th of September Legion, the UDN, and several former smaller groups that merged in September 81 as the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, or FDN. The FDN had its roots in two groups made up of former National Guardsmen of the Somoza regime. Its chief was businessman and former anti-Somoza activist Adolfo Colero Portocarrero. Edgar Chamorro later stated that there was strong opposition within the UDN against working with the Guards